Thanks, everybody. Let's kick off. I've promised our speakers they'll feel so much better afterwards, so I think we should really start now. So welcome, everybody. I want to acknowledge the Aboriginal people of this country, and most particularly the ones who we live alongside, part of our community, and give us all the chance to actually know Aboriginal people personally. So to make that acknowledgement to start off. Also, just want to say, for people who perhaps haven't been to a Living Histories before, perhaps they've come from elsewhere, perhaps they have just never been to one of these sessions, but it's run by Friends of Araluen. Most recently, we purchased with the takings from Living Histories and other fundraising a beautiful new grand piano for Araluen. So we put the money that you pay into one good service or another. Setting up today, Elizabeth and I thought perhaps the next things will be new chairs and tables for Witchetties. I think they're getting a bit tired. So anyway, Friends of Araluen raised money and they put it towards all kinds of good projects, if it's purchasing art for Araluen or in the case of the piano, or just on a needs basis, we contribute to the funds that Araluen has available. So just in saying Friends of Araluen, there's the hard workers. Karlika, who's the chairperson of Friends of Araluen. Elizabeth and Virginia, Elizabeth Verstappen and Virginia Loy on the bar. Anita, the wonderful money handler and our accountant. So thanks everyone and welcome to everybody. Welcome to Jocelyn, to Keith and to Suzanne, who are our speakers. But thanks everyone for coming. It's a great crowd. So initially, it's my pleasure to introduce Jocelyn. Jocelyn Davies and I, we met up to have a talk about today and about other things about our lives. And we met at a little cafe in Adelaide called Communication Issues. I thought, well, that's actually very interesting. I wonder what's behind that. Anyway, I think you'll find, listening to Jocelyn, that this girl doesn't lack any commitment. I don't think she has any issues, and I think hearing about her story will be testament to that. So thanks a lot, and thank you, Jocelyn.
So I push this button, do I? Left, this one to go left and right, okay. And is that sound okay? I have a habit of not working well with microphones. Is that okay? Okay. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today on Central Arundel land and pay my respects to traditional owners, custodians and elders. And this presentation does contain photographs of Central Australian Aboriginal people and other people who have died, and also some adult themes, and probably I have to do a trigger warning, so I hope I don't get upset as well as you. I'm Jocelyn Davies. I turned 68 yesterday, and I've lived here nearly twice as long as anywhere else in my life. It's 19 years since I planted my asparagus plot, 19 years that I've loved my mulberry harvest, first mulberries today, and the intoxicating smell of my navel orange tree in the spring sunshine. And these markers of spring are especially poignant this year because they're really early. And that's scary. And it's also poignant for me because this is my last spring in my Alice garden. I'm moving away later this year. You might know me from my work as a researcher first in Desert Knowledge Cooperative Research Centre, and then CSIRO, and more recently Central Australian Aboriginal Congress. I'm a geographer and I've contributed to research to support Aboriginal land management, adaptation to climate change, food security and Aboriginal health. And along the way I've been a bushwalker and a buffle buster and a bird watcher and a dog lover and a field naturalist and a yoga practitioner and even an artist sometimes, and I've contributed to good governance of community organisations. And I love how I can be and do all these things and more in Alice Springs. Today I'm talking about my journey to Alice Springs. It took decades and was full of learning about country and community. And I'm going to tell that story through my influences, people who influenced me to come here. So living in Alice Springs, it helps to be brave, because you might find you have to do things that are hard to do. And I'm brave. I got that from my mother. My father never asked my mother before he applied for a job in Australia. We were in Wales, where he was born, where I was born with my brother and sister. And when my father got the job at Sydney University, my mother thought it would be a great adventure. So here she is, in the wan sunshine, on the deck of the SS Orchids with us 3 kids, May 1962. And it's fitting that my father is not in the picture, because he wasn't in the picture for most of my life. Being brave, my mum used to take us on holidays, her 3 kids and sometimes some friends as well, always with a loaded up VW Beetle. And she was never a good driver, and some of the tracks were steep and rough. She was brave. Our father wasn't brave. That had been knocked out of him by the trauma of his Second World War service. He was handsome and damaged. And from my father, I picked up an unhealthy attraction to handsome, damaged men. Sometimes fun and sometimes a lot of pain. Also from my father, I got my grounding in the struggle. My father carried the pride and fight for his Welsh language and culture. Well before I was braving the cold wind on the deck of the SS Orchids aged 6, I already knew that to be Welsh meant to struggle for culture and country. Growing up with the consciousness of that struggle made me a soft target for activism. My final school years in the early 1970s coincided with the moratorium marches against Vietnam War and protest against apartheid South Africa. And one Sydney march was in support of land rights and anti-racism, led by Aboriginal activists, including the late Dennis Walker, Bajam Noonuckle, a founder of the Australian chapter of the Black Panther Party. Bajam's lifelong struggle was for recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty and treaty. And some years later, when I got to know him in the 1990s, I told him, you were an icon of my teenage years. And so he was. Meanwhile, back in 1972, I was in my last year of school. And here's a picture from our Year 12 formal. 3 people from that same little gang at Hunters Hill High School came to Central Australia. The first one to come here in 1973 was my brother Hugh. He's sitting down on the floor there. He was only here for months, and he came in 1973, year after we finished school. The second was the gorgeous creature on the far right with a sarong, that's Peter Bartlett. And the third was me. This photo is from a mini reunion this year in Alice. Peter Bartlett, Sam, also from our little school gang of 50 years ago, who was visiting. Peter came to Central Australia in 1975 and he's lived at Yindamoo, Kintor and Alice. Always a good mate for me and with an accomplished and knowledgeable family. It was 1973 when my brother Hugh came to Central Australia. He was helping out on a Simpson Desert expedition. I think it was looking for rocket debris, among other things. He stayed on, he got a job easily because he could cook, ride a horse and a motorbike. He worked on Jervois Station with Rick Morley. 6 months station work saw him turn from boy to young man. He saw in the start of the record-breaking rains of the summer of 1973-74 and because he was on Jervois Station, which records weather for the Met Bureau, he recorded the start of those weather record-breaking rains, and he added new chapters to his letter to our mother as the weeks went by, with no one getting in or out by road or plane to take the post. An Aboriginal stockman called Alex made an impression that stayed with my brother Hugh all his life. Hugh spoke of Alex as one of the people who motivated him to struggle for justice for Aboriginal people. Hugh became a photographer and an activist for community and for the Indigenous struggle. This photo by Ellie Gilbert shows part of the display of the Justice, Freedom and Hope mural that Hugh conceived and worked on with Koori students in Sydney in the aftermath of the 1988 bicentennial protests. That was the biggest gathering of Aboriginal people ever in Australia. My brother photographed it. The work was unfinished, the mural was unfinished when Hugh died early in 1994. My dear brother killed himself. He was 39 years old. He was only twice as old as he had been when he worked on Jervois Station. He was a year older than me, and he was meant to lead me through those milestones, turning 40, 50, 60, approaching 70, all the decades I've been and done without him. My heart weeps for all the people who've loved people who killed themselves. It never goes away. Meanwhile, back in the 70s, the late 70s, I was getting to work in national park management, seeing lovely country and making some lifelong friendships. Mostly we'd travel by vehicle, but once or twice I got to go on a horse. I had studied Chinese language and history, etc. at ANU in Canberra. I was following an interest in the communist revolution in China that had been sparked at school. But I got into backcountry skiing and bushwalking in the mountains. And after graduating, I didn't look for a job in foreign affairs or trade or something to do with China. Instead, I studied geography externally, and I got a string of jobs in New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, and I worked there for 10 years as a ranger and then a planning coordinator in the southeast of New South Wales and northern New South Wales. And in parks, I worked with lots of Aboriginal people, and sometimes I partied with them too. Back then, there were no words in English language for Aboriginal peoples caring for country. But by the time I left New South Wales Parks in 1986, I'd realised that there was more to conservation land management than I'd been able to see through the lens of the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Act. And I was starting to appreciate that people's conservation practices depended on their culture. And I learnt a lot more about this as the years went by. But as my sister Branwen recently reminded me, I'd actually learned very early on in life that conservation attitudes were determined by culture, and this was the lesson of the rabbits Billy and Runner Race, the first pets my brother and I had in Wales. When we came to Australia, we missed our rabbits, but we were told that rabbits were vermin in Australia, and we couldn't keep rabbits as pets. And of course, as I learnt later and got to know Aboriginal attitudes to rabbits, I had the whole complexity of people valuing rabbits or seeing rabbits as vermin open up before me. And I learnt my first deep lessons about culture and conservation in China in the late 1980s while working in a panda reserve. Wolong Nature Reserve was managed by government staff who were Han Chinese people, and it was the home of Chang people who had deep knowledge of the mountains and the pandas and spiritual connections. But the Han Chinese people didn't even have a common language to talk to them. And the reserve also had many visitors from Western countries with their own views of what should happen for conservation. And I realised that Chang people's country was being managed top down by the government, just like those parks I'd managed in New South Wales. I'd known, of course, that those parks in New South Wales were places where Aboriginal people had cultural ties. But when I looked back at those New South Wales parks from China, I saw for the first time that they were unceded Aboriginal land. I also realised that I had a big learning journey to do in Australia if I wanted to understand what this meant. And I did a lot of that learning in the desert, particularly in South Australia. I came back from China to lead a 3-week-long seminar for National Park and Wildlife Managers, which travelled to the Flinders Ranges, the far north of South Australia, as well as Kangaroo Island. This was 1989. There I am in the front row kneeling. As this picture indicates, park management then was by and large a man's world. From this study leader gig, I scored an opportunity to work on reconciliation and joint management partnerships between Aboriginal people and government in some South Australian parks, places that weren't politically prominent like Uluru and had much smaller budgets. And personally, I started to get to know Aboriginal people as people whose country I was living and working on. Along the way, in Ceduna, I fell in love with an Aboriginal man. As well as strong chemistry, we had a political history in common. He'd gone to the East Coast as a young man to be part of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. And out there on the edge of settled Australia, as Ceduna is, we shared this connection to the struggles of the 1970s, and no one else did. My perspectives on country were deeply challenged. I was a bushwalker, used to leaving no trace and travelling self-sufficient, but I learnt that country was healthy when it provided you with food. Many people in Ceduna put up barriers to me, a white woman, being in a relationship with that Aboriginal man. Looking back, I can see it differently, that they were warning me that their man wouldn't be good for me, and quite soon that relationship became violent. So in Ceduna, as well as some fun times, I learnt much about contemporary Aboriginal culture that I never wanted to know. I learnt firsthand that violence is normal in many Aboriginal people's lives. I was told I was the weird one because I hadn't encountered violence before. I learnt that grog had a central place in this violence, and in the words of the late Dr. M.K. Turner, recalled to us at her funeral recently, everything changed with alcohol and the violence that came with it. Australia-wide, 35 women have died at the hands of their partners this year. That's one a week, more than one a week. And 40% of women who live alone, as I do, have come out of a violent relationship at some stage. And you might not believe that this brave, accomplished woman was also physically and emotionally and financially abused. On the outside, I've only got a little scar to show for it on my left cheek. It's like a fake dimple when I smile. I took that relationship from Ceduna to Canberra and the first year of my PhD research. I went back to that relationship after I had become Dr. Jocelyn Davies and moved to Gawler, just north of Adelaide, to work at Roseworthy campus of Adelaide University. The enduring attraction and its psychological underpinnings are difficult to fathom, I know. I ended it often. I learnt that leaving the relationship is the most dangerous time, the time when he would react with most violence. Much later, I read that if he ever chokes you once, he's likely to do it again and to kill you. He did choke me once. I could have been killed. Alice Springs was a safe place for me in those troubled years. My sister Ruth was here. Many of you will know Ruth Jones, teacher librarian, who moved to Alice from Baumelia at the start of 1982. Ruth and Bob Kessing married in November 97. This photo is from the first time I met Ruth at Taronga Park Zoo. Ruth is on the right at the back of the howdah, on the back of the elephant, then my sister Branwen, then me. And I also call Ruth my sister because we grew up together. Her parents and mine were students together at University College Wales. Her Welsh father encouraged my Welsh father to do what he'd done, get a university job in Australia. In the UK, he said, the English will never appoint a Welshman. With Ruth as an anchor point in Alice, I visited Central Australia a few times in the 80s and met more people here. At the 1989 Australian Mammal Society conference, I met some of the Cyro crowd, Steve Morton and Mark Stafford Smith, as well as legends like Ken Johnson and Peter Latz, and Charlie Carter, who led Ruth and I on our first walk up Mount Sonder. I talked to the conference about pandas and some of the cultural dilemmas for their conservation. Once or twice in the early 90s, I ran away to Alice for respite from the emotional and physical abuse I was experiencing in Ceduna. Alice was a safe haven, or was it? I engaged a counsellor in Alice Springs to help me understand and change the cycle of abuse, and the counsellor sexually assaulted me. He explained that I could free myself emotionally from that abusive relationship, break the bond by being intimate with him. I actually can't remember if that counsellor had sex with me. Certainly he lay down next to me. The rest is blank. And for more than 3 decades, I'd forgotten that this happened. Then one day last year, out of the blue, I remembered. So yeah, #me too. Other times in the 90s, I came to Alice for work. At first, while living in Suzanne, this work was for South Australian Government on joint management for Witchetty National Park. Then my work was on the same country in community-based planning with a one-year Aboriginal corporation and people from the Archie, Taylor, Alice, Doolan and other families. Their aim was to realise their old people's aspirations to live on that country again. This planning process formed part of my PhD research. I learned much about culture, community and country in healthier ways than I had earlier on in Suzanne. And I noticed that every time I went through Port Augusta heading north, my heart opened up like the big sky above. Maybe this feeling first came to me from my mother, who'd loved the high country in Wales and later in the Snowy Mountains, where she took us as kids walking on holidays. From the mid-90s, I was often under the big desert sky. I was coordinating teaching for University of Adelaide on Indigenous Australians and environmental management. I ran a 10 or 12-day long field camp for the students to come and learn from Aboriginal people on country. And I was also consulting and doing research to support Aboriginal people and use and management of country. And I went to the Australian Rangeland Society conferences and grew my desert networks that way and learnt more about the work of some of the Syro Alice Springs researchers, and I think that's where I first met Margaret Friedel. I got to know fabulous Aboriginal people who hosted my students on their country and taught them. Also, Peter Yates and his family. Peter was land management coordinator at the APY lands in the mid to late 90s. And after Peter moved to Alice Springs, I soon also linked up with Fiona Walsh and Jock Morse, who were also working to support strong land management. Fiona Walsh and I had known of each other for many years, including through my PhD supervisor, Elspeth Young, herself a pioneer in research to support Aboriginal land management in Central Australia. 2 books published in 2002 put Fiona and me and Elspeth and a host of other contributors, who many of you will know, at the forefront of raising national awareness of the importance of contemporary Aboriginal land management, how conservationists and Aboriginal people could work well together managing country. So Planning for Country was Fiona's contribution that she contributed to, and Working on Country was where I contributed. Jock Morse came into this picture through a workshop that Peter Yates, Fiona, Jock and others invited me to in Alice Springs in 2000. It was exploring how using desert plants economically could support stronger livelihoods. And Peter and Jock went on to start Outback Bush Foods, buying seeds and fruits harvested out bush by Aboriginal women and selling them across Australia. Getting to know Jock closed the loop for both of us, because Jock had known my brother and I'd known Jock's brother, and both our brothers died. Alice became an important place to me because of these many Alice people who I'd come to know and love. So I was very interested when, in about 2000, the emerging desert knowledge movement put out a call from Alice Springs for researchers and business people to get involved. A couple of years later, I was excited to be offered a part-time role in the first management team of Desert Knowledge CRC, job sharing with Elizabeth Ganter. Here's a photo of me from around that time, and it's rather amazing, since Elizabeth, who's here, and I worked so closely together, I don't have a photo of both of us together. So it's a good thing she's here. Elizabeth was in Darwin and I was in Adelaide. Our shared role spanned the deserts. It was tough work, cajoling researchers who'd not worked together before to collaborate. Some of the new relationships that have formed lasted a long time, like Will and Elizabeth, still together after 21 years. By 2004, when our shared role was wrapping up, I knew it was time for me to move to Alice. I didn't have a job to come to, but thanks to Margaret Friedel and Mark Stafford-Smith, there were opportunities on the horizon. And I could see that if these didn't work out, there was lots more in this vibrant community to sustain me. to sustain me. So I came to live here, and Alice has sustained me and grown me strong. Thank you.
Thanks again to Jocelyn. I actually don't have any brothers, but I would like this man to be my brother. Keith Castle introducing him. Thanks, Keith.
Thanks, Anne. We're up? Yep. I thought about this whole project and of talking about what it was, and my introduction in the little blurb was I didn't know what I was going to be when I grew up, and so you've then got to try and figure out what you're going to talk about. And so what I thought I would try and do is think of, and I really appreciate the opportunity to think a little bit about this because you need something to force you to do it. And I thought, well, what are some of the things that occupy my mind a lot? What are some of the things that have been drivers or underlie who I am? And I guess I suppose there's a lot, but I thought of three things, and one is the spiritual. And for me, everyone has a spiritual life, and it's more about who you are and what you do, and how do I make sense of that, and how do I sustain that. In fact, just a little story, probably about a month ago, we were travelling out bush actually with John Kavanagh, which was a lovely thing. But and I was driving along in the car, and there's a young fella, probably 20, and son of a good friend, and he had a tattoo on his leg, and beautiful tattoo with plants and so on. And I said, tell me about your tattoo. And he said, well, I've always been interested in plants and I've always wanted to conserve plants, and I thought I'd put a tattoo about it, and I put colours on it. Do you like the colours? I said, I think it's amazing. And I then said, look, I didn't grow up in a time where tattoos were a big thing, but and you're now studying to go into plant management and so on, but what happens if you decide to be a merchant banker? And and I thought he'd say, well, I'm never going to be a merchant banker. But he didn't. He actually said, if I become a merchant banker, the tattoo will remind me of when I was 20 that plants were important to me. And for me, that's a spiritual story. I'll tell you a spiritual story about me too. I was a very earnest young man and went to church, and probably some point in time we've all been through an altar call service where they do all the stuff, and then people who want to give their life come out the front. And I was very earnest, and this was a special thing happening for 4 days, and so they did it 4 days in a row. Anyway, I came out and I was so passionate, I came out the front the first night, and then I came out the second night, and then the third night, and then they were all starting to talk about, what's this guy doing? He keeps coming out. You've only got to come out once. And then one of the fellas came up and he says, you've only got to come out once and then you're saved forever. And I thought, oh, right, okay. So I was hoping I'd get 4 out of 4, but anyway, I didn't go out the last night. And I probably haven't been as earnest since then. A second thing is about place. Place has always been interesting to me. Stella thinks I probably should have become an architect, but it's something more than that. It's a career thing. It's about a sensibility or a practice or something about my relationship with place. It's always been important to me. I've loved tracks and walking on tracks, and I've loved buildings, particularly old industrial buildings. I love industrial buildings. Maps, bushwalking, canyoning, canoeing, And trees, I used to secretly plant trees in shopping centres and stuff. And then the third one is community, and always this tension between the individual and the community, and how I was born at a time where the community was taken over to some extent by a move to individualism. So those three things. But the thing I was just going to talk about now, so that sits behind what I'm talking about. Yeah, growing up with my brothers, I grew up with two older brothers, and they both became tradesmen, and I kind of took a professional way into life. But I was always grateful to, and they were my best friends for the first 20 years of my life, and so I learnt a lot about the trades and that whole visceral, practical way of going about things, as opposed to a professional thing, which is a knowledge head thing. And so that had a big influence on my life and the way I've gone about living life, and even whether it's out at White Gums fixing up this or that or making this or that. So that's been a significant thing for me. And I thank my brothers for that. And that's a picture on the property, and all of the paper daisies and a bit of pitchery there too, and all blossoming together. And I'm sort of using a bit of a theme of the track for this conversation, and sometimes the track gives you options, and you have to make a choice. And so when I left school, I did a... hang on, I'm on the wrong page. I missed one. I went through the starting gate, and then I passed it. But I just wanted to tell you about the starting gate. I was born in Sydney in 1951, 5 days after Ann Davis. And but we didn't get to meet each other for another 56 years. My parents, a bit like Jocelyn, lived a post-war life. My father was pretty traumatised by the war as well and fairly absent. My mother was a wonderful, wonderful woman who parented with a light touch and just decided the three brothers could grow each other up. So now I've got to, starting to, I left school, and I thought about a lot of things, and being in those three things I talked about earlier, you'd think I would have chosen to go in a direction something like Jocelyn and going to national parks, or I did think about soil conservation, but they told me you needed a lot of science, and I didn't think I was very good at science. So, and anyway, my mum, God bless her, who was a bookkeeper, said, "You could become an accountant, love." And I thought, oh, yeah, all right, okay. Anyway, one of the things, I went for an interview, and the man who interviewed me was a chartered accountant, and he just so impressed me as a man, perhaps because my father had been absent, and I ended up taking on that job, and I worked in his accounting practice for 22 years and eventually became a partner. And whilst I still think back, and I'm not sure why I did that, I still learnt a lot. And one of the things I learnt was how relational accounting was, and because you'd be working with clients and you'd sort of become part of teams everywhere, and that was something quite special to me. And the other thing I think I learnt was that that accounting was an ethical thing, and this man who took me on, Norman Brigden, really pushed that into me. And so this whole PricewaterhouseCoopers thing has been quite a stab to the heart for me, that an accounting organisation could be so unethical as to betray other people's trust. So, but I did accounting for 22 years, and then I got to a point where I hit a... Oh, see, I'm not doing this right. I hit a fork in the road, and I sort of thought, no, I want to do something different. So I did a Masters of Urban Planning, because that naturally follows from accounting. And I finished that, and I left accounting, and I ended up getting a job as an urban planner in the church, of all places, partly because it was at 40, it was a bit hard to sort of turn up and say, I want to be a planner and I'm getting on. So anyway, I had an interesting job working in the church, but that ended up shifting. So I still hadn't figured out who I was, but in terms of work, and that moved into resource development and then into social research. And we did a lot of work, and the fellow I worked with, Peter Caldor, developed the National Church Life Survey, which actually became the second largest survey in the country after the census. And we were looking at the social drivers of church attendance and really trying to bring into that conversation in the church what does sociology tell us about the church. And for a while I then became the director. Peter Caldor, the fellow who was a very significant researcher, left, and I ended up becoming the director of the National Church Life Survey for 7 years. And I had no research experience, and I'm thinking, I don't know how to do this. And I was working with a whole lot of really clever researchers, and I learned another thing is that, and I think it's a really important management bit of wisdom that I took, and that is that these guys and women know more than I do. I'll help them be successful, and if they're successful, they'll make me look successful. And so that sort of became a bit of a motto for me. I'm now going to move to Alice Springs because that was sort of a bit of the background. And so another gate, and I'll stop at this gate. But one of the things that was happening at that same time is there was protests in Sydney, and I remember walking across the Harbour Bridge and for Aboriginal, I think it was reconciliation, but there was an element in me of saying, I ethically believe in this, but I actually don't know any Aboriginal people, and to be truthful, it doesn't mean much to me. And that sort of troubled me. And one time we were down in Canberra, and I went to the tent embassy. I might have spoken to your mate. And I went and spoke to the Aboriginal guys there, and I said, how do I get to know, I live in a part of Sydney, and there's no Aboriginal people living there. How do I get to know there? And he probably thought, oh, these weird questions white fellas ask. And he said, you could go and live where Aboriginal people live. And I thought, yeah, that's what we could do. And that started a conversation between Stella and I about possibly moving somewhere where Aboriginal people were. And in the same time, we were travelling, we came to Alice Springs, and we really loved the whole impact of Alice Springs, its beauty, its complexity, the fact that Aboriginal people were here. It really took us under its wing. David and Sue Woods, who've become good friends, told us about white gums coming up for sale, and we thought, all right. So we came up one New Year's Day and had a look at white gums, and we thought, wow, can you buy this? And so we ended up pursuing it. It was a sort of a bit of a downtime. There's a lot of downtimes on property in Alice, but it was one of those. And so we got it, and Stella and I came, and when we came, we said, we're not going to talk about whether we like Alice Springs or not, because we're coming here to live. We're not coming here to see if we like it. And we did that we said we wouldn't talk about it for 5 years, and we didn't. And I don't think we've talked about it since, really. But the next one is, that's our first day at White Gums. And David and Sue Woods have put a little welcome sign on the gate for us. And the other little hut is the first hut I built, which was inspired by walking into a hut in the Bogong High Plains in freezing rain and finding a hut that was like the grandest palace you could ever see. And so we got second-hand stuff and built that little hut on the block. And many people use it as a retreat spot. In fact, anyone here is welcome to use it if you want to. I just want to acknowledge at this point of time that this has been very much a joint journey for Stella and I, that I couldn't have done it by myself, and Stella says she couldn't have done it by herself, and the day-to-day life is very much a shared one, and I acknowledge you wherever you are. There, yes. And both of us, and we asked ourselves, what is it that we want to do with this place? And I think it really boiled down to we want to create a place that's safe for people to welcome people, and that they feel safe and welcomed here and can enjoy this place. To pay for the bills, I actually applied for a job at the Desert People Centre, which was a management role managing the relationship between CAT and Bachelor Institute. And I had a job application, and I spoke to Peter Taylor, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. And I was talking about it, and we'd finished sort of the interview, and I said, look, because coming from Sydney and not knowing anything about Aboriginal people, I said, look, Peter, I may be ineffective, but I don't think I'll be a disaster. And yeah, probably getting to know Peter better, it's probably not the right thing I should have said to him, but anyway, he still employed me. And I think it's one of the great things about Alice Springs is that the people are usually hard up for people, and so they can employ ineffective people as long as you're not a disaster. And I should say that's where I worked for 7 years, and that's where I got to meet Anne Davis, and we had a lot of fun together, and also Karen Burchell, who was the equal representative from CAT. So Anne represented Bachelor in this relationship, and Karen represented CAT, and they were lovely years. Oh, hang on. The first one, yeah. One of the biggest influences for us was that when we'd moved into White Gums, David Woods, probably about 2 or 3 months after we got there, said, oh, look, we've got this Aboriginal family, they need a bed for the night. And we had one of the little houses there, and he said, can they stay? And we said, oh, yeah, that should be all right. So they stayed the night, and then the next day they said, can we live here? And we sort of asked a few people, and they said, look, John and Mally Kavanagh are very well-respected people, and it should be fine. And we said, oh, okay. And they ended up living with us for 12 years, and I think, yeah, that family changed the way we looked at the world. And probably the interesting thing is, I talked about those 3 things at the beginning: the spirit, place and community, and their stories, their being spoke to all of those 3 things. And we started running spirit journeys on John's country, taking people out to country and him talking about his country and just being on his country. And it was many other people were influenced by that process. And I think he really loved the fact that white fellas were listening to what he had to say. A second influence that's changed us was the Central Australian Aboriginal Women's Choir, and I travelled. Morris Stewart, God bless him, asked me to be the tour manager when the choir went overseas to Germany and then to America, and that was largely, organising hotels and transport and stuff, and so we did that, and I'll tell you one story that was quite chilling but also uplifting in a way. On the flight to Germany, so we'd just got on the plane, we're just about to get on the plane, first time going overseas for the vast majority of them, and they finally all sit down on the plane, and it was on a big Emirates A380, and all separated by the bulkheads, so we weren't all in the one spot. And then it happened, someone came down and grabbed me and said, oh, there's been an incident. Firstly, there'd been a heart attack, and I thought, oh, no. And then I went up and looked, and I was upset for the person, but I was glad it wasn't one of the Aboriginal women. But then secondly, they came back and said, there's been an incident with the Aboriginal women, and we went up and talked to them, and this man had got on the plane, and excuse my language, but he said, how the fuck did they let you women on this plane? And the stewards came up to them and they said, if you don't write a letter of apology to these women before we get to, where are we going to? To where? To Dubai, you'll be arrested in Dubai. And he apparently did that. But the part of the story that is really, to me, the endearing part of the story is in the flight, because the women were in 4 different sections on the plane, and in the flight, one little group started singing, as they do. They sing anywhere. And they started singing, and then some of the others heard them and they started singing, and then all the 4 groups in the plane, who couldn't even see each other, were all singing. And sorry, I do get very emotional with this story, but it's probably the best concert I've ever heard in my life. The whole plane was just, what's going on? But it was very clear because everybody could see Aboriginal people on the plane, but they couldn't see them all. But they knew they were there. And they sang a couple of songs, and the whole plane just burst into applause. And then the following, or probably 2 days later, we got a letter from the CEO of Emirates thanking the women for their singing. Anyway, these women were another huge influence, have been another huge influence on me, and also probably their issues around the spirit and the way they've reconciled a Christian input into their own traditional way of thinking has been a really significant thing as I've watched that happen. But in the end, one of the things after the American tour, the women, and this was Daphne, who lives out at Araluen, was probably the senior woman in the choir, and she said, "Oh, Morris, we want to talk to you." And they said, "We want Barb, your wife, to join the choir." And Barb had sung with the choir from time to time, and they said, and he said, "Oh, I'm sure Barb would love to do that." And then they said, "Oh, that Keith fella, we want him to join too." And Morris came and told me this, and I said, "Morris, they don't want a white man in their choir. I don't think that's a really good look." And he said, "Okay, I'll go back and tell them what you said." And I thought, maybe I shouldn't have said it. But anyway, he went back and told them, and he said what I'd said. And Daphne looked at Morris and he said, "Morris, we will decide who we invite onto the choir." And he came back and told me that, and I said, "I'm in." And that's been a wonderful experience for me to do that. So, yeah. Another thing that's been a significant Aboriginal influence is that I've worked on the Achenanatera Aboriginal Corporation in Santa Teresa for 7 years. And interestingly, it's that accounting experience, financial stuff, has been useful in sort of helping manage the finances down there, because at one point in time there was a bit of a mess. So all these little things you learn in life, even though you don't think they're important, they are. The James Range Band, this was this year in May at our Ghost Gum Rhythm and Blues, and this was one of the loveliest moments because Georgia, Ryan and I, who organised this thing, have always wanted this to be a shared space with Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people, and we've certainly had lots of Aboriginal bands play, but on this night, this young group from Araluen played, and there was about 200 white fellas dancing to these young men who this was almost their first performance, and they were terrified, and it was just a wonderful thing. And Georgia and I thought, this is what we want. This is what we want. And so that was a wonderful thing. And that whole Ghost Gum thing has been a wonderful experience for us. And similarly, we've done some Edge of the Sacred conferences with Miriam Rose Ungamer and MK and different people talking about listening to country. And all of these things have fed into the next thing I was going to talk about, which is the start of my buffel career. Oh, hang on, where do I should push it that way, shouldn't I? And you can see that's the hill next to us on fire. Now that hill I lit in 2012 with my lawnmower, and it quite quickly went right up the hill, and I was mortified, and it totally got, it happened in about a minute. It just a spark set off from the mower. It hit a rock, set off the stuff, and up it went. And so a friend, Tim Lean, who was staying on the block at the time, who used to run nurseries and stuff here, he started telling me we could spray it after it had been burnt. And so I've spent a lot of time on that hill getting rid of the buffel. And since that time, I've spent a lot of time in lots of places on the block getting rid of buffel. Jocelyn's helped me, as many others have. And it's pretty much my favourite way of spending time. And that's what happens when you get rid of the buffel. The Thai lotus returns. The other thing I've really grown to love is making tracks, and I've made quite a lot of tracks. And in fact, I've made a track from Honeymoon Gap to Heavy Tree Gap. If anyone wants to walk on it, I'm happy to do it with you. And I guess just that whole notion of the track as metaphor, it's an indicative of a way forward. You can choose to leave it as it's a way forward to follow, but it will unfold and you can't control it. Sometimes you're alone, sometimes you share it. There may be different challenges and so on. So I quite like that. But just finally, the thing I love about Alice Springs is we all live here together. It's a complex demographic. If you look at the stats, this town is overrepresented with unemployed people, but it's also overrepresented with university degreed people. And it's also overrepresented with fascinating people. And you're my exhibit A. Yeah. I love being in a multilingual town, notwithstanding I can only speak one language. And I love the humility of people here. It seems to me only the East Coast who know what we should be doing. But once you've lived here, we become a bit more engaged in its complexity. And perhaps most importantly, my experience in Alice Springs has shone a fresh light on the link between the three matters of my mind: the spirit, the land, and the community. And I'll finish with a little saying from Thomas Merton, who's a theologian. And he says, "The true solutions are not those which we force upon life in accordance with our theories, but those which life itself provides for those who dispose themselves to receive the truth, trusting life itself and nature." Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Suzanne Bryce, long-term Central Australian resident. Like to introduce Suzanne Bryce, long-term Central Australian, with a big story to tell. Thanks a lot, Suzanne.
My water bottle's going to fall off. I have to get organised. How's that? Is that good? Okay. Oh, thank you, everybody. It's been quite a process doing this. If those of you who've done it will know. And I'm grateful for all of you here who are supporters and feel friendly. Closer? Do I have to start again? Like that? Like that? Okay. Thanks everybody, all my friends here and people who are potential friends. It helps. Yeah, and thank you to Annie and Kalakamoti and the rest of the team, Lizzie. And very special thanks to Fiona Walsh. I wouldn't have any images. She laboured over my PowerPoint for a very long time. Thank you. So, I'm exploring belonging, and it's a big theme for me because I've been here for a long time and have a tremendous sense of belonging here. So that's really what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about it through the frame of all the people who got me to this point, really, the friends, the family, the mentors. So there's not so much about me. Well, there's some details, but it's very much about the people that got me here. And some of them have passed away. I've just warned Franny Coughlin. Some of them are Aboriginal people who've passed away, and some of them are Aboriginal friends who are very much part of our world. If I look down, this is okay. So, my oldest son's also in this story, younger one too, a little bit. But the two babies that I had taught me everything. They taught me everything about love. And that's a very special kind of belonging also. I can't fit everybody in, so, half an hour. My focus is the mid-70s to the mid-80s. And incredibly special time, but a lot of you know about that time here. So I'm just going to name people for a start. The first one's Glendale Schrader, who's an absolute pioneer. He's the maker of health services and an innovator, and I don't have a photo of him. Oops. Technical hitch. Am I doing it the wrong way? My hitch. Peter Latz. Somebody who, right from the start, we would take plants to him, we got to know him, we became friends, we did lots of bush trips. A real touchstone for the country and a wonderful friend. So, without telling you the story about Ushi, there's a brother theme here today. Ushi's my brother, and I got him in the bush. And he's no longer here either, but his wife Eva is mother of Daisy, and the two little girls are, big women now, and Milika wasn't born yet. But these people were incredibly important for me. And Eva, she was the one who she had a German background from Vienna, Austrian, sorry, and she was bilingual. And she was able to work with language really well, but she just had to know what people were saying. So she was a great role model for me. Then Diana James, friend forever. We were all out bush together. Such an inspiration. Desert tracks, songlines, the Ngintaka story. She's really put herself on the line a number of times for these really strong stories that she helps people to tell, Aboriginal people. and Greg Snowden. And this is a wonderful photo because it shows the way he belonged, his tremendous comfort in the bush, all sorts of skills that he had, Greg and Diana. Penny Tweedy took that photo. Josephine, who was Ushi's second wife, and Ina, who recently became Alyana. And these two are very, very important people for me too. And Anne and Bill. We've shared our lives right through. I got to know Anne and Bill when I knocked on the door of the caravan and said, "Can I have a shower?" It must have been 1978 or 79 or something. People at Yarra, our little kids are there. Just wonderful all these years. Such friendship, a lot of songs, a lot of stories, a lot of cups of tea. A cup of tea is code for love and support. So over time, I've collected a lot of stories from my friends, from family, from other people, and I've become a real oral historian, amateur enthusiast. And so I also want to acknowledge these two, David and Margaret Hewitt, who lived in Armata in the 60s. And David is a real touchstone for me because, and that's Andrea Mason too, David could tell about times when he would drive out on a track from Armata to Peeblejarra to bring the checks and the food. And Peeblejarra didn't exist. It was a group of people who were semi-nomadic moving around, and they would find the people. 15 years later, we're living in a place called Peeblejarra. So for me, that's really significant to understand what changed. And they've been very patient with me. I've done a great many interviews with those two. So, some of my story. I was a student at La Trobe Uni, and it was a pretty informal, small place. And there was a lecturer named Doug White, who later came to work here. And he was in the School of Education. He came up to Haasbluff to visit Philip Toyne, who was an ex-student, and Philip was in a one-teacher school at Haasbluff. When Doug got back to the uni and he started telling people the stories about Haasbluff, I heard them, and I knew that I needed to go there, that was it. I was going to Haasbluff. And Doug helped me get there, and Philip was coming down, and we met on the stairs, and he said, "What can you do?" And I said, "Oh, I can do craft." So I put a sewing machine and a box of fabric dyes on the train, and soon after I was in Haasbluff. And Dick, you'll know these two, Jimmy Jugadai and his wife Narbota. I'm sure you remember them. So being in Haasbluff was like, nothing I'd ever experienced. And I tried to help in the store. I always remember beautiful old ladies sort of shouting at me, "Lutifa, Tilipi." had no idea. Lucifer, of course, is a box of matches. Yeah. So, Philip went on to become the lawyer that he worked on the ground from 76 to 81 when land rights was achieved in South Australia, in the northwest corner. Incredible achievement. My first job, I had Jenny Green as colleague and my first friend in Alice Springs. And that's a pretty special photo. Rick Smolin took that. And that's Robbie Davidson on this side. And another friend, Julie, who went to an ashram. Robbie went with the camels, as you probably all know. And we were all friends and we would hang out. Jenny sent that up, and I thought, oh well, it's a good way of a little bit of self-promotion here and just setting history straight, because different people tell different stories about Rick Smolin, but those of you who are here, remember Main Street, Sunday morning, Sorrentinos, Il Sorrentino, anybody remember? So I was desperate for something to eat. And so I was prowling around the top end, which is now the mall, near the chemist. And this lanky fella was coming towards me with a lot of cameras around his neck. And so being a local, I said, "G'day." And what was he doing? And he was looking for things to photograph, of course, and setting up a project. So I took him home, and we took him out to the camel camp where Robbie was. She lived at Bazos, which was a very different place then. And the rest, everybody knows. Rick helped Robbie get the geographic funding, and off she went. So Jenny and I did this work for a year, but then I got a job at IAD, the Institute for Aboriginal Development. And I had 3 really significant mentors there. And one of them was a woman called Margaret Tischler, who probably nobody possibly remembers. Ah, wonderful. So this is her teaching school in Yarlata. And she said that people used to dig holes to sit in really hot weather, dig a big hole and sit in damp ground, and she learnt to do that too. It was really quite amazing. Anyway, she taught me a whole lot of things at IAD, and I got basic community development skills. And here's the wonderful IAD people, Jim Downing and Yummy Lester. They're in the language lab, and maybe some of you have sat in that language lab, learnt Walbri or Pitindadjara or probably those two. It was quite an experience. When Jim left, Yummy was my mentor for all the years I lived out bush. And he was wonderful. Aninja was my first language teacher in that language lab. Oh, what happened? I leaned on it. And the love of history, again, that's Dr. Charles Dogood. And Aninja visiting him in a big crowd with me in Adelaide one time. So she remained the most wonderful friend. and teacher. Until her death, she was truly a mentor for many of us. And the woman who had the vision for NPY Women's Council, where I work, she didn't actually want to lead the thing, but she really wanted to see younger women step in, and they did. She gave me a lot of confidence, and living was hard out there, and she really did give me confidence, and she herself was unafraid. Now, this old bloke, this is my brother. This is Ushma. When I first saw him, he was at the Centre for Aboriginal Artists and Craftsmen, a place that I think Kentucky's there now. And it was a place where Aboriginal art could be seen. There was no carpetbaggers or anything. It was a really wonderful gallery, and I guess Dick would know, but Mpartnwe may have started there. Anyway, he was there, and he was there with a group of old blokes, and they were chopping out artefacts. And it was another one of those moments. And I just knew. They were talking in this language, Pitjantjatjara, and I was flabbergasted, and I knew that I wanted to be like that, just like that. I wanted that easy rapport, I wanted the comfort, I wanted to know, just like Eva said, what people are saying, and I want to talk to people. So he imprinted that in a really powerful way. I didn't know him, and I don't think I spoke to him. So, about 8 years later, had no idea, but by then he's my brother, something I'd never had. And the new baby between them is my niece, my daughter. We've been close all her life. So not only did I get to be a bit like that bloke, Ushi, but I married his first wife's brother. That was our Christmas holiday with little Inna newborn. So Ushi's been gone for a long time now, but the imprints were really strong, and I still feel like I'm doing his work. And when I think about it, he dreamed up the idea of the archive, the Ara Iritita archive, which is like a photo album for Anangu, where they can access their pictures without having to personally hold on to them. There's 50,000 images and lots of documents. Julia worked on it for years, and it's truly an extraordinary thing, and it's basically his idea. She also pioneered land management, which has been topical today, because Josephine taught him how Aboriginal families look after country, and he was able to pass that on, and it really was the groundwork, wasn't it, Fiona, for land management. So here's Steffi Reno and our dog and a wonderful friend who was the first woman doctor out in that northwest corner. back then she was called Mary Whiten, and she became Satya Sankalpananda, and she brought a lot of wonderful things after that period of time, taking up yoga herself, becoming a teacher, bringing yogic philosophy to Alice Springs. Many years with yoga, and some of her dear friends are here, like Pat. It's probably not the best photo of her, but it was of the era. Her sons recently decided to sell her house, and I went for a last look. And Satya passed away with many years of working with cancer, and she was an incredible inspiration and a teacher for many of us through that time. And she died very peacefully among family and a few friends at home. So going for a last look was remembering a lot of things, and I went into her bedroom where we'd spent so much time, and the bath was dirty, and they were getting it ready for sale, so I cleaned the bath, and there were tears, and I could hear her saying, "Thank you," because, it was karma yoga. There's your dad. He was a beautiful gardener. He did great work. Very comfortable out there. See his bare feet. So we took our first precious son back to Kalka to live when he was 1 month old. Oops. There he is. Such a little boy. I shudder to think that I did that now. Especially, oops, where am I? We brought him to this, our home, which we built ourselves at Kalka. Didn't have a washing machine. I can see the washing on the line, but we had to borrow the washing machine from next door. Life was very communal. And when we wanted things, we built them ourselves. So that was Ushi's new house, with everybody building it. It was a concrete roof. It was crazy. And we built this office with mud bricks. And that crazy owner builder, what's his name? John Archer. It's still there, and it's used by Ninuku, the arts mob out there. Little Aji was on that team at 3. Where am I? So we had tremendous support, for the little family. We got a lot of people helping us, looking after the baby, loving that we were there and just really supporting us. He was my dad. And this is the work that I originally did, was craft work. And there, it was always in the open. We had no buildings. The women are sorting out how much fabric they're going to get and their dyes. And then I'd go to another group and do much the same thing. And they would make batik over an open fire. And just a few more pictures of things. That's Josephine actually making batik. And a lady at Putta spinning wool. People make rugs and beanies and did wonderful spinning and crocheting. No buffle. She would sit there. One year she just sat amongst all the yellow daisies. But things changed when Aji came along life changed. My name changed. Instead of calling me by my name, people called me Yaljanki Kungunju, which is the name they gave him was Yaljanki, and we shortened it, or he shortened it to Aji. But I became mother of my son, and that's what people called me for years. I never heard my name really again for a long, long time. In contrast to the absolute silence around my pregnancy. But if there's not too much shadow, you can see that people were curious. And so I was asked to work with nutrition and mothers, babies and kids, and it was not the first nutrition program. I'd have to credit Margaret Hewitt years before with that kind of work, but it was as innovative as we could go. I haven't included pictures of that work really with little kids, but an extraordinary thing for me with that work was that the people wanted to teach us, me and the health workers, they wanted to teach us about bush food and their food and all the things in the bush that were important to them. So it was a combination of what we could do with store food and then going out bush, doing a lot of hunting and gathering. And I did a lot of recording. Oh. So this was Mum and Dad, Japali and Panchidi, and they lived right nearby. They adopted me from the first day, and we did everything together. And they would call the shots. They would say, such and such, there's a food on, let's go. Come and see this, or come and see that, or let's go and process this, or pick that, or 4 years, 3 years, 4 years we did that. And it was, I was very fortunate to be able to do that. And that was a day I'll never forget because I got bitten by a redback. But during that hot day, there was so much productivity, all that chaff, and the seed being winnowed. This is tiny seeds that are like a pinprick. If you stick a pin into paper, the seed is no bigger than that. And it was called wongono, or woolly butt grass. And sadly, there's buffle in a lot of places where there were native grasses. We worked in stores. This was Iranju store, no fridge, but at least fresh food starting to come in, which was very exciting and never lasted very long. But it was all part of this nutrition program. And up in the top left corner is Mandy Lee, who became a friend at this time. She was a dietitian working here in Alice Springs. And she came out, she wanted to work with us. And we cooked, we worked in schools, we'd cook anywhere we could find firewood. And she was a great inspiration. She began a commitment here in Alice Springs 40 years and more to work for Aboriginal nutrition, researching, teaching, and always mentoring me. So I was learning a great deal about plants, and so was Aji, and foods. Often out in summer, people would hunt these big animals, the parenti. And on this day, a lady in the car, and we'd really got nothing, and we're on our way home. And she said, stop. And I stopped the car and she got out, she had a rock, and the parenti was there frozen, and she danced around it for some time, just coming in closer and chanting and dancing around and mesmerising until whack with the rock. And then, of course, the kids were fascinated. Aji had a great time. Oops. Little Aji. They're Witchetty grubs. So this really couldn't go on forever. I guess there was a time limit on it. I was pregnant. I was very pregnant with Danila, and I felt like I needed a house. I needed somewhere to live that was a little more secure than the shed. And although we did eventually get a shipping container, moved back to Alice Springs, and that was in 1984 when Danila was born a month later. So the sense of belonging that had been nurtured in me in all these ways that I've hoped to show you, it really did grow, and it went with me. I have it now. And I see myself now among friends and a mentor myself, and living with an abundance of family. Is there any time left? If there is, I would like to read a poem that I wrote some time ago, and it's about Ushi after he'd passed away. So it's called Belonging. I hope it's not too obtuse anyway. We'll give it a shot. You will be a worker, my niece Ina said, and gave me instructions. You stand at the graveside, on the workers' side. The mourners file past and shake your hands. You read the faxes, help manage the family if grief gets too much. You lot go first to the cemetery and see the coffin into the ground. This was a family adapting to change, and for me a gift of belonging and how to behave. She pulled up in the car alongside this lady unknown to me. I live in Armita now, she said. I saw you the other day. Ina's your niece, right? He was your brother, right? I knew him. And it struck me so poignantly that I helped to keep his memory alive, not simply as an auntie to his kids, but as his sister standing in his place. I've always been so proud of the brother I got in the bush. I'm standing in-law side where he would have stood with his wife's brother in the grave. And I forgot to show this one, but this is a new phase of my belonging where I'm a grandma. And it's Danila's little baby Balian and his cousin Ina. That's me. Thank you.
Thanks again to Suzanne. I think one of the themes for me is that because a lot of us have lived geographically away from our actual families, we have made family of each other. And I think that is reflected in the stories that we've heard today. And I think it's something about that real richness of Alice, that we know each other, we have easy access, we live where it's warm, where there's an informality. And I think there's a richness of community that really mirrors real family. So thanks everyone, thanks again. 3 wonderful stories.